Please welcome Skift Senior Research Analyst, Pranavi Agarwal.
All right, welcome everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Pranavi Agarwal. I'm a senior analyst at Skift Research, and today I'm going to be talking about the state of travel as we see it today. So let's kick it off with a question. Whoops, yeah, so the state of travel. So let's kick it off with a question. And I think it's an important question that we should all be asking ourselves in the room today. And it's this: is travel recession-proof? Now, why am I even asking this question? Especially after 5 years of headwinds and tailwinds from the pandemic, we're finally back to normalized levels of growth and normalized levels of recovery. Globally, travel revenues are back to 2019 levels, but it's not just on the top line, on the bottom line as well, profit margins are back. So we're back, we're profitable, things are looking really good. So why am I souring the mood? Well, maybe it's because of these kinds of headlines, including one by Skift. So we recently wrote a piece on how recession fears are impacting the travel industry, and we wrote that piece because clearly people are worried about a recession and they're concerned about a recession, and that worry is being reflected in the stock markets as well. So we can see on this slide that global markets are up 15% since the start of the year, but global travel stocks are down 3 to 5%. So clearly travel stocks have underperformed the overall market since the start of the year. So what's going on? What does this all mean for us in the travel industry? And if there is a recession today, could travel be recession-proof? Now, I just want to give you an answer up front that I think no. I think travel as a discretionary item, really as a luxury discretionary item, will never be fully immune to the effects of a recession. But I do think that things have changed a lot in the past decade, and if there is a recession today, I think travel could do well in a recession. But it's a lot more complex and it's a lot more nuanced than it used to be. And I might indulge in an analogy here, so hear me out. So think of a watch or an iPhone. So in 2009, if you spilt a little bit of water on your iPhone, it probably wouldn't work properly again. It really wasn't very waterproof at all. But today, if you spilled a glass of water on your iPhone, it'd probably be just fine. It's pretty water resistant, but that's not to say that if I chucked it in the deep end of a pool, that I'd still expect it to survive. It's still not completely waterproof. And I think that analogy is very fitting for the travel industry today as well. And I might amend my original question from, is travel recession-proof, to is travel recession-resistant? And to give you a preview of the answer, I think yes. I think today the industry is more recession-resistant than it used to be. And it really comes down to this inherent shift in the consumer mindset. I think it's a mindset where travel has become a higher priority for consumers. And what does that mean for you and your businesses? I think it means that consumers are increasingly in control, and they're increasingly in the driving seat of all your businesses. Okay, so we at Skift Research, we asked ourselves, okay, so what does a recession-resistant industry look like today wherein consumers do have more control? So we think it's an industry where travel is more important to consumers than ever before. We think it's an industry where consumers are much more sophisticated shoppers. And we think it's an industry where consumers have much more choice to shop around because there is a fragmented distribution landscape, more so than it was maybe a few years ago. So let me prove those 3 points to you. So here's why we believe that travel is more important to people today. So we believe that travel has moved down Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So pre-COVID, it used to be this fully discretionary item. It used to sit right at the top of this pyramid in this kind of self-actualization, kind of transcendent stage of the pyramid. But post-COVID, it's moved down the pyramid. It's become much more of a necessity in our lives, and it now sits here. And I think that's because travel has really become this important tool for finding a sense of belonging in our lives, a sense of connection in our lives, and it's gone from being a fully discretionary item to really becoming a much more fundamental need in what is really an increasingly complex world. And because of that, and by virtue of that, it has become more recession-resistant today. And we are seeing that despite the fears of a recession, despite the challenges out there, consumers are still motivated to travel. So this is some survey data from our quarterly tracker of consumers in the US. And we can see that today there's the highest share of consumers who are wanting to increase rather than decrease their spend of travel since the pandemic started. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be very optimistic as we look into the future, but we also need to be realistic, especially when it comes to price and value. And there's still the reality of increased price sensitivity in the market. And earlier I said that the industry could be recession resistant, but not fully recession proof. And the reality is that if there is an economic slowdown, consumers will feel it in their wallets. But fundamentally, in a recession resistant environment, what I think we'll see is that consumers will become much more pickier shoppers. And even if you're a consumer that isn't affected by inflation, higher prices, I think we'll see that consumers will become much more sophisticated shoppers. And we are seeing that higher prices are impacting consumers. 67, so this is some survey data from Skift Research again, 67% of consumers have felt that their vacation plans have been impacted by higher prices in 2024. And I think that's a sentiment that many of us can relate to in the audience. And so I might run a little survey of my own in the room. So raise your hand if you feel that for your hotel room in New York this week, or for a holiday you might have taken over the summer, you feel that you've spent more money than the value you've gotten back in return for that same hotel room or holiday. Okay, yeah, quite a few hands, maybe 67% of hands. Good to see that our data is accurate. Well, I think in response to that, I would say that if there is an economic downturn, and we're not sure if there will be an economic downturn, but if there is one, and consumers are impacted by higher prices, I think what we'll see is that consumers will turn to programs such as the loyalty programs, the credit card programs, to try and get more value for money. And we can see on this slide here that it's not price that is the utmost of importance to consumers anymore. Service is just as important as low prices. And I think what we're seeing is that consumers have become much more savvy. They're joining lots of loyalty programs, not because they're necessarily loyal to those companies, but because they're trying to gamify the system. They're trying to yield as many perks and rewards as they can for the same amount of money spent. And I think that really neatly brings us on to our next point, which is that today there is a changing and a fragmenting distribution landscape. And there are new players today, strong players, that didn't even exist 5-6 years ago. And I think that what that's done is that it's given consumers much more choice to shop around, and it's really returned power back to the consumer's hands. So one company that is really contributing, I believe, a lot to a more fragmented landscape is Google. Now, Google is the starting point for many consumers' shopping journeys. And ever since Google introduced free organic listings to their search platform in 2021, I think what that's done is that it's allowed consumers to discover new OTAs and small OTAs and the direct site in a much more prominent way than before, when it was just those paid sponsored listings on Google. And those paid listings were, of course, they were dominated by the big OTAs, Booking, Expedia. But when it comes to the free listings, the story is a little bit different. So on this slide, this is some pretty cool web scraping analysis we've done of Google's free listings. And it shows how frequently companies are featuring on Google's organic listings. And you can see on the left-hand side that there's no one dominant player on the free listings. And you can see on the right-hand side that there's a long tail of small OTAs all featuring on Google's free listings. So what does that mean? Well, I think it means that Google has really contributed in a real way to a democratization of online search. And it's really facilitated a much more competitive distribution landscape than it used to be a few years ago. And one new competitor that's really risen up in force, and it's a competitor that's not on Google, it's not on this chart, but whose inventory is powered by the big OTAs who are on Google, it's the credit card companies. So companies like Capital One, Chase Travel, they've really entered the travel space in a big way. But that's not to say that they're starting from scratch. Not only have they onboarded their inventory really very quickly through B2B deals with companies like Expedia and other players, but they're already in a position where half the US population is using these credit cards already, or have at least heard of them. And I think it means that these credit card platforms have really grown very quickly in a very short amount of time, and they've really become formidable competitors in the space. And this is a key chart. I absolutely love this chart. Again, some survey work from Skift Research. So we can see on this chart that younger consumers, Gen Zs, millennials, they're booking their travel on the credit card platforms rather than through the OTAs. So it's a really incredible stat. And even if in the room you're feeling a little bit of skepticism that could these credit card platforms ever outcompete the big giants, Booking and Expedia, well, I would say that at least one thing you can agree on is that change is already upon us. And it's come upon us in a much quicker way and in a much more real way than we could have ever anticipated it to be. So to conclude, I think the consumer is now in the driving seat. And companies have to be hyper-focused on value, on generating new ideas, really adapting to the new wants and needs of a modern travel consumer, and they have to find new ways to deliver value for money. And if they don't do that, you risk being left behind. And it really connects back to the theme of this conference. Is this a period of renewal for the travel industry, or is it a time of reckoning? I think it's both. I think in many ways it's renewal, because travel has become a higher priority for consumers, and post-pandemic, that's a great opportunity for renewal for our industry. But in other ways, it's also a reckoning, because consumers have gained back power, and if consumers aren't listening to the new wants of a new consumer, a new modern consumer, and they aren't respecting that power, then there's a reckoning coming for your businesses. And either way, whether we're entering a period of recession or good economic times, I think the fact remains that consumers have gained back power, and that is a trend that is here to stay. And finally, I'd just like to say that all the themes I've covered in this presentation and many more across other travel verticals, we cover in a very comprehensive report called the State of Travel 2024. So if you haven't seen that report, you can download it via this QR code. It's completely free to download and free to read. And you can also subscribe to Skift Research if you want further access to more of our deep dive reports. So do check that out, and thanks very much for listening.